Do a short intro and then carry on. Hello, alle mensen. Good evening. So, thanks for Katie for joining us. I'm Ruben. I'm a mountain club member, and we have an informal group which we call the Treeple, which try to organize monthly talks about trees and things related. We've organized previously a talk on the geology of the Magaliesberg. Prior to that, very interesting talk on the Gorongosa National Park. And we stream this as well. So if you can't attend in person, you can always attend online. Thanks to Katie for coming to talk to us. It's something I've been interested in for a long time. I've traveled through the Richtersveld and seen those amazing quiver trees, and unfortunately seen some of them are dying.
Yes.
So we look forward to your talk about learning more about their dynamics and what's happening in terms of climate change.
Cool. Thanks, Ruben. All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I love the concept of a group of people who come together to talk about trees. A room full of fellow nerds. That's my most comfortable place. So, yes, my name is Katie Murray. And I am currently a PhD candidate at the University of Pretoria and the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew in the UK. I used to work at Stellenbosch University Botanical Gardens for about 6 years. I volunteered, interned, hung around unwanted, was an associate, and any number of things that I'm still affiliated with them now. And I learned a lot there about plant conservation, how to do it properly, how to do it effectively. And I realized that there aren't actually a lot of people that do it properly, and that it is a very big passion of mine. So this has influenced the way that I look at my field, which is botany. So I studied my BSc in ecophysiology and genetics in oxalis, or people might know them as searings. And then did my MSc using radiocarbon dating to estimate the maximum longevity of quiver trees. So Ruben told me that you guys have recently had a talk about radiocarbon dating with baobabs by my advisor, Stephen Woodbourne. So I decided not to drag on about radiocarbon dating for half an hour, but I decided I'd give you an overview of the work that's been done on the quiver tree so far and why so many have found it interesting to work on, and then tell you a bit about the radiocarbon dating results I found, and the conservation collection that myself and Stellenbosch Gardens have set up with the Namibian Botanical Garden. So I've been running the quiver tree monitoring project since around 2021, and in that time I've traveled to around 40 populations of quiver trees throughout their range in Namibia and in South Africa. I'm very lucky, I do know. So, for most people in the room, if you don't know what a quiver tree is, or a kokerbome, they're Aloidendron dichotomum, depending on how strongly you feel about taxonomy. And most of you in the room would recognize that as a typical kokerbome. It has a lollipop shape, it's about 4 meters tall. You can compare the height to my unit of measurement, Richard, and loving partner, and the 3-meter pole that he's holding. And this is the typical look of a quiver tree. They have like an extremely rounded crown, and this is a very healthy specimen that I would say is in adulthood. This is standing in the Karabos kokerbome Woud, which is by Nieuwetville in the Northern Cape. You can see in this picture a healthy array of different ages of quiver trees. And this is, in my opinion, and in my experience, the most populated and the healthiest population of quiver trees we have in existence. And it is around the furthest south that you will get a quiver tree. This is the end of its range, as we'd say. The range is the total geographic area where you'd find it. So while this is how you guys will have seen the quiver tree, I've seen quite different quiver trees. This is how I know the quiver tree. This is tree number 1895 on the mountains next to the Sand Sea near Ababis in Namibia. This tree is about 6 meters tall. And I must say, we didn't actually include it in the monitoring. We just thought we had to get a picture of it because it was a big specimen. And very beautiful. This is also how I know the quiver tree. A 9-meter tall quiver tree at the northern end of its range, near place in Namibia. That's the tallest quiver tree I've ever seen. It's the biggest one. And it's just an astounding specimen. I know that there's a couple of people in the room that would be thinking, does that not look like the bastard's quiver tree that you find in the Richtersveld? The Richtersveld is a couple of thousand kilometers away, actually. Maybe I'm not that good at judging distance anymore, but it's very far away, and this is considered still a quiver tree, although I am investigating that during my PhD thesis. On the right, you'll see another quiver tree, monitoring number 3625. This is a quiver tree where multiple seeds have germinated in one place in the ground and then grown together upwards. It's also quite a big tree right near the Fish River Canyon in Namibia in a very large population. And as you can see, there's a sociable beaver nest in the tree. And this depicts the importance of quiver trees to the ecology or to the ecosystems in which they exist. They occur in the Namib Desert, in some savanna areas, in the Karoo Center of endemism, in the only desert, true desert we have in South Africa, as well as the succulent Karoo and the Nama Karoo. These are all arid areas that are quite devoid of trees and height. So quiver trees are actually, they're considered as keystone species and ecosystem engineers. So ecosystem engineers in that they provide a structure to the ecosystem, in this case height, for birds to make their nests in, and perches for raptors, as well as shade. It's one of the only sources of shade around. Additionally, they physically provide nectar to a whole host of and a diversity of insects, and are sometimes the only source of water in extreme drought. So this is one question I get a lot, is it not just animals chowing on the quiver trees that's killing them? I've seen trees in populations that are picked by baboons, for example, to be the only tree that they go and eat from. The rest are completely fine, but then there's some of these quiver trees that develop a weird growth form because of repeated breakage, and they don't die. So this is where it becomes tricky to try and understand certain patterns of mortality in these trees that have been noticed since the late 90s. This is also a way that I've gotten to know the quiver trees, which I'm very lucky to have done. When we go out and monitor, we have to find as many trees as possible, and it's always wonderful when we find juveniles. In the middle that I found in the Tsakaya National Park in Namibia, otherwise used to be known as the Spurgebied, that seedling is probably one or 2 years old. They're really slow going and growing in the wild. And on either side of them, those juveniles are probably 2 to 5 years old. It's really difficult to find them. They do camouflage a little bit. But yeah, mainly this is how I know the quiver trees. I know them as scrappy field notes, databases, maps, graphs, pieces of scientific evidence. This is the majority of the time that I spend with the kokerbome. All of these things come from an accumulation of research that has been done on the quiver trees since 2007, when we started picking up that there was strange patterns in their mortality and people started paying attention to them. And this is mainly due to this lady, Professor Wendy Foden. She's the head of research, climate change research at SANDPARKS. For her MSc, she was brought this problem by people like Tony Rebello and Norbert Jurgens, who had seen in the Richtersveld in the succulent Karoo in Namibia whole stands of quiver trees dead. And it started looking like it was in hotter places. So she went throughout the range, as you can see in this map on the left, and did monitoring counts of the trees. What she does is walks a 2-kilometer transect, and you count or you monitor 100 live and dead trees along that transect. So you take measurements of them, of their sizes, of like their stages of decay, of whether they have infestations or any damage, and make extensive notes about the population in that way. What she found is that, what you can see here on the left, sorry, the legend is cut off, but the yellow and red dots are where there has been high mortality. So that's counted as a proportion of dead trees to live trees. So that would be, the more red ones are like a 80 to 90% mortality that was observed in a population. Whereas the green spots, where you can see further in the south here, and in some isolated pockets throughout Namibia, that would be where there is less mortality. Her study found that there was a correlation between these places with higher mortality and increased temperature, and these were in areas that were kind of closer to the north of the range, as well as at lower altitudes. This was a typical pattern that started being recognized in the early 2000s that became known as the fingerprint of climate change. It suggests that the species range is becoming uninhabitable or hostile at some parts, whereas in other parts of the range it is better for them. And globally, there are multiple hundreds of studies that showed that towards the equator, where it was getting hotter, that's where more species were either experiencing mortality or moving away from, if they could. And towards the poles, where it was cooler, they were experiencing less mortality and more juvenile growth. And that is the pattern that she found. So this has been quite a contentious study, but it was recognized as Africa's first climate change indicator. And since then, monitoring has also been done on its close relatives, the bastard quiver tree, so Alodendron pilansii, and Alodendron ramosissum, which is the maiden's hair quiver tree. So all three of them are listed in threatened categories on the IUCN and the SANBI red lists. Alodendron pilansii is critically endangered. There are less than 6,000 individuals left alive in the wild. Ramosissum is declining now as well, and the threats that have been listed for all of them include poaching of young juveniles. That was really big in the early 2000s for people's gardens, where they would usually rot. Land use change for mining, damage from sand moving from the mines, and climate change. So a lot of them have been experiencing declines where their populations are hotter. Additionally, climate change projections or projections of the climate niche suggest that 92%, 30%, and 19% of their climatic niche is going to be lost under climate change. For Alodendron pilansii, this means that it will not survive without human intervention. And now we have to start asking ourselves, how is that possible? How are we going to do that? What is the best way of doing that? So, as you can see in the map on the right, Alodendron dichotomum has the biggest range in purple throughout Namibia. Ramosissum is the second most, and pilansii has an even smaller, more restricted range, broken up into 3 subpopulations. There has been debate in the past about whether they are or are not different species, and there are currently 26 different definitions of what a species is, which is not very helpful. For me, what I find useful is trying to understand, for conservation, what do I treat as individual units? And according to phylogeny, so their genetics, their morphology, the tree shapes, their inflorescences and such, they are considered different species. But I'm happy to have a crack at arguing that. But what we want to do when we're looking at how to conserve a species through climate change, essentially, the first step is to try and understand whether its range is responding, and then secondly, try to figure out how it would respond, or try to predict how it would respond. So in this graphic shows a theoretical population inside the circle, and a climate change occurring where a warm edge comes in and there's a cold edge, like with the Quiver trees. Theoretically, in the warm edge where there is a climate change, and what we have seen from other species around the world, is that some of the subpopulations that make up the whole population will go extinct where the climate changes, and if the species is capable of doing so, it will shift further into the cooler, more pleasant parts of the range. A tree that lives for a few hundred years has less of the ability to shift to new places than, for example, birds, animals, or annual flowers like daisies. So this is a very important consideration for trees, specifically. Overseas, they've seen that tree species there experience lagged responses to climate changes. So climate change will occur. This has also been observed historically through genetic analyses. Populations will remain in sight after the climate has degraded, with a few individuals that are more resilient to that climate change. And while the range will continue to expand into the colder area. But on the far right, what you'll see is maybe a scenario of habitat fragmentation where the entire range of species breaks up further and further into smaller bits, where you have pockets of things that are kind of differently adapted to each other over long scales of time. Why it would be useful for us to understand how the Quiver tree's range is responding to any perceived climate change is that we can focus then on where we need to invest our efforts. We won't be able to conserve every single population of the Quiver tree, but where do we focus? It's important to kind of triage at this point and say, these populations are really important, or landowners here or custodians really want their trees in sight to stay alive, and we want to invest in conserving them in this place or this place, but maybe not here because it's going to get too hot. Maybe not there because they'll be able to migrate by themselves. So that brings us to essentially how does a species respond to climate change? And there's three ways that have been brought out in the literature. One is that they adapt in place. That means that the species would have to have enough genetic diversity that there will be some individuals that will be able to survive under future conditions, while others might go extinct. The alternative is to migrate to where the climatic conditions are still good for that species. And they are still able to live there based on other kind of conditions, like there isn't anything competing with it, there's the right soil, etc. And the third option is to go extinct. So obviously that's not what we want to hear. But things do come into existence and go out of existence, and extinctions have been quite normal. Unfortunately, they are accelerated now due to climate change, and especially in South Africa, because we have such a high diversity of plants. We have 23,000 species of plants. It's 25 now. It's 25,000 species of plants. We won't be able to intervene if every single one of those is sensitive to climate change. It's a difficult concept to try and figure out what we should prioritize and what we shouldn't. But in an area like the Namib and the Northern Cape, where quiver trees provide such a large service, an important service to the rest of the ecosystem, as well as bringing in tourism and supporting livelihoods in that area, it seems like a good one to focus on. So how do we conserve species under climate change? Instead of just hoping that species can do it for themselves, we have to look realistically at whether or not species will be able to either adapt or migrate. Like I said, for trees, it's not likely, because they have longer generation times, adaptation to new conditions will take longer. So there's a concept called assisted adaptation, and assisted migration. And I'll explain that more in the next slide, but the third option is to let them go extinct and choose that. I personally don't like choosing that, and I find it interesting to try and figure out how to combat the destruction of biodiversity. So the only thing that would get in my way is not getting funding, and it often does. But this is a map of the quiver trees annual average temperature, for example. And you can see in this picture that some of the populations across its range exist in cooler places where it's yellow. Some of them exist in hotter places where it's red. When you move further east towards the Kalahari, away from the ocean, away from the fog that comes off of the Atlantic. So in this situation, you must remember that the cooler places are getting hotter. But theoretically, what we think is that if there are ones that exist in hotter areas now, they might have some adaptation to more extreme temperatures. So you could conduct what we call assisted adaptation by transferring genes from proximal, so close by populations, but ones that experience more extreme temperatures, and hopefully introducing that genetic variation or diversity could improve some of the other populations' chances of survival under future conditions. Alternatively, assisted migration would be just moving populations to new suitable areas where there are the correct climatic conditions, but where they haven't been able to reach before. So, for example, at the south of the Quiver Trees Range, I said that's the furthest south place that they exist, in Khanabos. And that might be either because it's too cold further south for them to grow, or because there's a wind barrier that prevents their wind-dispersed seeds from moving. So there could be very close by areas where they could have a viable population, but just haven't managed to get there. These are also controversial issues, but these are the types of actions that we are considering in order to allow species to carry on to exist in the wild. So there's a few things that we needed to ask following the initial findings about the mortality patterns in the quiver tree, about how they will respond to climate change and how we can conserve them under climate change. So the first one is to continue to monitor how their populations are changing and to continue to try to understand whether it's in response to climate change or whether it is, something else. The second thing is, can they migrate in time for these climatic changes that are predicted until the end of the century? And that requires an understanding of its migration rate, which requires an understanding of generation length. The generation length of the species is dependent on when it starts flowering for the first time, when it starts reproducing for the first time, and when it dies. And those are two things that we didn't really know for sure with the quiver trees. And then thirdly, we want to know, can they actually adapt to new climate change conditions in place? So that would be informed by understanding how juveniles from different parts of the range respond to different climatic conditions, as well as trying to understand if there is genetic variation in the trees across the range. So, first, the way that our team has been continuing with this work is we're carrying on with the repeat monitoring. So from 2003 through 2008 and now for the past few years, we return to the populations that were initially monitored. We find trees that were tagged already. It used to be 25, we've increased them to 100. It's really long days in the field, measuring the basal circumference, height, number of branches that have been destroyed or fallen off, number of inflorescences or the flowers, like flower-bearing branches, counting their health. And we counted on the dead trees as well, so we can try and get a better understanding of how fast they decay. So that's going to continue indefinitely. And that's something that sometimes some, for example, Sandpark's honorary rangers have helped with. So there's a few people who have gotten involved with doing some of the monitoring. It's great fun, but it is hard. The second thing that we needed to do or one of the things that we want to figure out to help us understand how their populations will respond and how their demographics will change is, like I said, the migration rate. So we'd need to understand that generation length, and then that will help us simulate their demographic changes. So that's changes of how their populations move forward in time, how they grow or how they decrease. And one of the main things, like I said, that we didn't know is how old the quiver trees can get. Historically, people it wasn't thumb-sucked necessarily, but the estimation was 350 years old. People had guessed that from repeat monitoring, so repeat photos, but you can't observe the entire lifespan of a quiver tree. Once it gets to its adult age, we don't know how long it sits there until it starts falling apart. So that was the foundation of my master's thesis. I worked with Stefan and used radiocarbon dating to date the quiver trees. Radiocarbon dating, very expensive, very intense operation, very accurate, but it can't necessarily be used for repeat scientific measures. It was incredible that we had the opportunity to sample so many samples, and initially what we did is one tree per population in the north of Namibia. You can see there on the left. I don't know, many of you have probably traveled around Namibia, but this is quite close to succulent. In the top left you can see Brandberg there. That's the top edge of the range of the quiver trees. So this is very dry desert, hot desert. What we did is sample pieces of the quiver trees across their base, and then we measured the radiocarbon ages of each sample, and then used that to create a model to try and understand how they grew, their age, the relationship between age and growth. We found some really weird stuff. Mainly that they don't stop growing in the center of the tree, like every other tree does. They don't die in the center. Or they're replacing material at the center with new carbon, because every single tree that I've sampled, and it's not just these four, there's plenty more, at the center there was always contemporary carbon that had been deposited, that was contemporaneous with the outer edge. And then inside, the ages would decline. So it's been difficult to put a direct age on these trees, but it was phenomenal to find out that one of our trees, you can't see, was likely around 680 years old when it died. And that is, it could not have died younger than that. That is the minimum maximum age. So that sample, I know that's so annoying. That sample was deposited 13 centimeters off center from the quiver tree's center, which means that it would have had to grow up before it started growing out. And we know that they grow up for around 100 years. So if it was 680 years old, we have to add 100, and that would make it 780. Give or take, I think that 800 is roughly what we're going off of there. We had difficulties with the other trees because they seem to be mixing at different points along the tree. So this has been a really interesting thing to find out as an MSc student, but a really tough thing to put a big marker on. But we're going with kind of estimates of between 400 to 800 years. So it's hard to generalize, but if you start putting that into formulae for generation length and combining it with observations that we have that they only start flowering when they're 60 to 100 years old, their generation length is around 300 or 400 years. So they have extremely slow turnover rates. In my opinion, you need to assist this thing to continue to exist. So this is something we have to consider for a lot of tree species, but especially slow-growing things in the deserts. I think it'll be quite important to consider for other long-lived succulents in the wild. But a nice hopeful piece of information is that I've spoken to some Chinese on their farms that have quiver trees and who have grown them from seed and watered them for 30 years. And sometimes if you are watering them and giving them the best conditions, but they're in their natural habitat, they can start flowering a lot earlier. So it's important to consider for conservation, because if we establish a conservation collection of these trees and we want to try and increase genetic diversity through breeding, we have to wait 40 years to do that. So it needs to start now. And it has. Other pieces of the puzzle that are being put together are juvenile responses to different temperatures. So we would love to know, do the juveniles, which is the most sensitive age or stage of life of these quiver trees, of any animal, do they respond badly to increased temperatures, to decreased rainfall? How do they respond? They are really resilient little things. So one of my colleagues, Karoo and Desert, did a lot of ecophysiological work with the juveniles. She was the first person I assisted in the field on this project, collecting leaves. You can't see any of the axes because I don't know how to put margins on things properly, but I'll just tell you. On the upper side, on the y-axis, this is carbon dioxide assimilation. So you use a machine to measure how much carbon dioxide a leaf is taking up over time. And then you expose them at different air temperatures, or you change the air temperature where it's taking up the carbon. And you do see an increase in carbon uptake as temperature is increasing. But what you do see is a very dramatic decline in the amount of carbon dioxide being taken up at low temperatures. So what this study told us is that quiver trees actually can't grow at colder temperatures. They start starving. They can't take up enough carbon dioxide to build their mass anymore and maintain it. That probably explains why you don't find them south of Hannabush. You find them in people's gardens, because they probably get just enough heat, but I've worked with enough of them in botanical gardens, and I've seen the ones at Babylon Store and that are struggling for their life, and that makes a lot of sense. So what we'd love to do is be able to understand if seeds sourced from different populations across the range have different responses to increases in temperature or stress. And that's something that I hope that's something that I hope to enable, because over the past few years, while I've been doing the monitoring of the quiver trees, I've collected legally with all of my permits a diversity collection of seed that is now stored at Stellenbosch University Botanical Garden. So there are hundreds, thousands of quiver tree seeds that are collected from all of the rare populations, all of the hard to reach populations, and even here you can see this is seed collected from Hannabush versus seed that is collected in middle Namibia on the left and right. The seedlings look a little bit different. We've been trying to figure out ways of measuring them. It's quite difficult. But now that this collection is at SUBG and growing out, we're hoping to get some students going forward to do some studies, which is very exciting. And then the last thing that is really important for informing how you conserve a species is its genetics, its population genetics. Whether there are populations that are inbred, that are unhealthy, that you don't want to use to transfer anywhere else, or that you want to target with increasing genetic diversity. Or whether there are actually even populations that are genetically adapted to hotter temperatures, so you can be more aware that they will actually provide an adaptive advantage. That is now what I'm tasked with doing for my PhD, or what I tasked myself with doing for my PhD. And I am just getting at the point where I can take my 384 genetic samples over to the UK to sequence and process them. So this is a picture of me taking my lovely partner, Richard, in the field when we were camping underneath in someone's cattle kraal. This is my field lab, plank of wood, sterile tissues, scalpel, goggles, gloves, and my trusty bottle of ethanol. We would collect leaves from 15 trees in each population, and every evening I would sit and clean the gel out and slice them, put it on silica gel to preserve it, and then I've been maintaining that collection, changing the silica gel over time for 3 years now. That's me in my field lab next to the fire, and that's kind of what one of the dissected leaves looks like on the right. Some of them I did bring home for my dear mother to help me with, because 15 trees per population for 8 populations does add up, and it takes about 15 minutes to process the leaf. So keep tuned, because in the near future I might be able to tell you something about their genetics. So all of the research is really interesting. There's a lot of interesting questions and a lot of beauty in the science around the species, but it doesn't change the fact that I've walked into many populations where this is the site that greets you. And what you can see is in this picture is in the background all of the things standing up. Those are dead quiver trees. You can see 1 or 2 live ones. It's a lot of dead trees. It's hard, it's very upsetting. I've been to populations where every single tree was dead. There was nothing alive, and they were all alive 10 years ago. So when I started this, there wasn't a conservation collection of seed that captures genetic diversity per population, and we've now started that at Stellenbosch University Botanical Gardens from across the range. Mainly because that came a lot from my background at the Botanical Gardens, but I was also inspired by a few people who I met along the way on my fieldwork, who are seeing their populations die and want to intervene. So they are already enacting principles of botanical conservation and nursery keeping. This is specifically at Canyon Lodge with the Gondwana collection in southern Namibia. They have an environmental manager, Michelle, who started growing out the quiver tree juvenile trees and started planting them out. They have an amazing nursery with 1, 2, 3-year-old quiver trees, and they measure them. But as you can see on the right, I know this one's in the sun, but a lot of them are planting in the shade. They protect them from herbivores for the first few years of their life. They water them once a week, and they're still struggling with the heat. So what we're doing now at SU is growing out a fairly massive collection of the seedlings from across the range. And we want to get them through the most sensitive part of their early life. And from there, we will share seedlings with other botanical gardens, like the Botanical Garden of Windhoek in Namibia, who I've been working with on this project, and other Botanical Garden Conservation International registered conservation gardens, who will either take care of them forever or will host the seeds until they are strong enough to be planted out in the wild. That is how we view the future of the conservation of the species, and we'll continue to try and build up the collection and share information on how to grow them and how to plant them out properly with multiple different partners. Yeah, that's my team. We don't have a photo together at SUBG. This is what the curator of the Botanical Garden sent to me. Honorary Nicole, AJ, who's working on conservation, and then me. And it wasn't all doom and gloom and hard work. You know, we got to take photos of the flowers, like stretch our muscles, meet amazing people who let us accidentally trespass on their land, like Clutch over there, change some tires, climb some incredible mountains like the Brandberg, and sit back and relax in the sand dune. I just want to end the talk by, this is just a handful of the different species that I took photos of throughout my fieldwork to improve or increase the number of iNaturalist observations in those areas. There's so many things that I've never identified, and such an incredible diversity of life in these hot spaces. And I just wanted to end the talk speaking about the fact that these quiver trees do represent and are an indicator for these places which are globally renowned for their biodiversity as in hot spaces. Deserts are not empty. They are not places that we can lay waste to mining and just forget about and try to ignore. The Richtersveld and the northern succulent Karoo was the first recognized desert or arid center of arid biodiversity hotspot in the world. There are over 5,000 species in that area. And if you compare that to the United Kingdom, which only has 1,500 species, it's quite a lot. It's amazing, beautiful diversity of life that I've been very privileged to see, and that I'd love to encourage you guys to go and visit those areas, support the local economies, etc. But yeah, that's me for now. Those are the people who have supported my permits, given me money, and supported my passion for these trees and this project. So yeah, I'd love to take some questions. Thanks very much.
Any of the Arid,
Yes.
looks like it's been decimated. Is that also due to climate change, or is it just short-term cost?
So there's been an extended drought in southern Namibia for a long time, but this is part of the difficulty in discerning these long-term variation with what is actually climate change. But there's a paper in 2016, which is a while ago, it's 10 years ago now, that looked at the increases in average temperature in sandparks around the country. And I think Richtersveld had an increase of 3 degrees already. And Alopesonia is another species that we've been working on the conservation and collection of. We don't know much about its genetic diversity. We think it's not that high, but there are a few different populations of it. They stopped flowering in the wild in 2014. I forgot to say, this was one of the things that drove me to start collecting for the quiver tree. It takes a lot of work to curate the seed collections. It takes many man hours and a lot of attention so that things don't rot, don't go off, all of the stuff, don't get eaten by bugs. But Alopesonia and some of the quiver tree populations essentially have stopped flowering because they're under so much stress. So that indicates to me that it is stress due to climate change, and because I say climate change because the temperature has increased over the past few years. There is resilience though, so like we went through that population. It is blackened. It is a lot of those plants, the majority of those plants are dead. For other people who don't know, they experienced I think 64% mortality by 2019, and I think it did get worse. But we're there in 2023 and a rain had come through and they were starting to sprout out from some places. So it's important to then make good genetically diverse conservation collections from those living ones, take cuttings, root them and things like that, and they're doing work like that at the Richtersveld Botanical Garden. They have an amazing and insane curator there, and he's doing great work. Yeah, Michelle?
For how long does the kokerbome seeds remain viable?
Not long, only up to 5 years in a fridge.
In the fridge and never found? Do they die
2 years.
in 2 years?
Yeah, that's what people have estimated. Yeah, they're very papery. Every single seed pod, there's like 70 to 100 seeds in it, and they wind dispersed. So most of them will scatter in the population, but some of them get swept up in these big wind gusts. So there's lots of seed, but it doesn't remain viable for a long time.
So obviously it's temperature that's killing them, right? About 2-3 degrees Celsius. What? Actually, why are they dying? Are they evaporating their fuel, water, or not getting
If I can add to his point, because
Yes.
you mentioned that carbon uptake increases with temperature increase,
Yes.
so why would an increase in temperature
kill them?
kill them?
So we see in a lot of other plants, there are these tipping points beyond which, for example, reactive oxygens, ROIs are reactive oxygen species, so like free radicals will build up in the plant body because they because heat shock proteins aren't working well enough to prevent the shutdown of photosystems. So it's essentially severe sunburn and then a response from different proteins that are dependent on heat for functioning. So the fact that carbon intake increases with temperature does show an adaptation to the desert. And that's one of the things with the quiver tree is you expect something that looks like that exists in the desert to be well adapted. What we're seeing in deserts around the world, and with other trees, succulent trees that look like this, is that they are actually getting hit first with these increases in temperature because they're already at the edge of their limit. So I can't tell you enough about the actual physiological response of heat stress. But one of the other things I didn't mention that we take notes of when we are monitoring is a phenomenon called shoot shedding. So they essentially drop all of their leaves in these areas where they've gotten really hot. And I think that that's a response to try and reduce the amount of photosynthetic material you have available, because if you have photosynthetic material available, it means you can continue receiving sunlight. And when it's too hot, your stomata all shut down. You don't have any ability to turn carbon into different acids and stuff. When you're at your edge, then receiving sunlight is just getting free radicals into the plant body, which will lead to a lot of destruction of those different structures. Yeah.
So,
and it's, yeah,
sorry if someone else had a question. So is that why they would die off so quickly, with that one population that you mentioned?
within 10 years.
10 years.
Yeah.
So they've been adapting for the last 100 years since the Industrial Revolution
To the climatic change.
and now they're at their age and dying quickly.
So if there was already adult plants, they wouldn't be able to adapt to the change that they experience in their lifetime. We have to remember that adaptation is a generational thing. So natural selection and adaptation only happens through successive populations being selected.
Okay.
So anything that has not responded yet to existing climatic changes has been resilient until now, and then it reaches its end point. But we still don't understand it fully, you know? This is something that we still need ecophysiologists in the field to understand it. I am a bit of I think I'm a bit careless when I say, you know, like my main concern is just collecting the seeds and getting them conserved. Yeah, it's what I would spend my time on first. But I also am a big supporter of, if people are doing research, take trained botanical gardeners and conservationists or horts along with you to the field, like co-plan these field trips so that you can make collections. Because the researcher that's going to do ecophysiology on these things in the field doesn't have time to do conservation collections, but it's really important. Yeah.
What is the germination rate for the seeds?
High. It's quite high. So we get like 80 to 100%. Yeah. It's not the germination that seems to be the problem. It's keeping them alive and preventing them from rotting afterwards. Rotting is the main problem with the seedlings because they are supposed to grow in quartzitic like rock. So they're meant to have a lot of free drainage and a lot of heat that pulls water out of their soil. So we had a big problem in Stellenbosch when we sowed them. They started to rot quite quickly because in Stellenbosch there isn't a massive vapor deficit. And we had to re-pot them at some point. So that was a bonanza. Yeah, I got in trouble with my curator that day. Yeah. So high germination rate, more issues following germination.
So, and I find that the wood of the plant exceptionally interesting. Like you mentioned, that we're so used to trees having dead wood in the center and then a live skin that grows out of.
Yeah.
So my question is, I imagine I'm seeing rings. Does it grow rings?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
It's a weird, it's a monocotyledonous tree. And those are very rare because monocots, so with plants you have dicotyledonous plants and monocots. which is supposed to be the grasses and the orchids and the things that don't form bark. They actually lost the genetic structures or the genetic architecture to form bark. They don't have that anymore. That was actually one of our colleagues at UP who wrote a paper on that. So there's a weird group of monocotyledonous plants in the asparagalus or Asphodelaceae asparagalus, such as Dracaena draco. So it's the dragon's blood tree you might have seen pictures of in Socotra, and the Dracaena, that's Cinnabari, Dracaena draco in Canary Islands, the Joshua tree in America. They all form part of this one Asphodelaceae group in the monocots that evolved what's called the monocot cambium. So they'll grow upwards. I don't know if you've seen a young quiver tree, but they're a pole for a long time. And then inside there's some just ground tissue and vessels that carry water and sugars. Then there's a hardened wall, a layer of cambial tissue that can be put on outwards, and then a photosynthetic layer. So actually the entire trunk is photosynthetic. So that's stressful. Like if your entire body is photosynthetic and you're receiving light all over, all the time, it can be quite easy to get stressed. But the storage that then accumulates in these layers as it grows out is where they keep most of their water, as well as in their roots on the ground. But also that's why they are white on the outside, is to protect that photosynthetic layer and to reflect as much sunlight as possible. Yeah.
So if you go and paint half the tree black,
Someone will call you an asshole. Excuse my language.
That's live on YouTube.
Yeah, no one on YouTube could hear what he was asking.
I'm going to ask you a very ignorant question. Why not just count the rings towards age?
It's not ignorant. It's because we didn't understand the relationship between putting on those rings and how they grow.
Okay.
Because we don't know how long it takes for them to get to the point where they start putting on that growth.
Okay.
It was a relatively recent. No, the monocot cambium was discovered in like 1913, but then no one focused on it for a long time, and then only recently, in about 2021, some people in Prague like described it coming from the other Dracaenas, and actually they took samples of one of Andrew Hankey's hybrids at Walter Sisulu for their paper, looking at the cellular structures at the bark's edge of these types of trees. So we didn't know if they put a ring on every year.
Yeah.
So you can't say one ring 1 year like you can in a lot of dicotyledonous plants, not all of them. But specifically what we know now is that tree, which we found was around like 700, 800 years old, had one of the smallest diameters, and it exists up there in the desert. So our theory is that they probably experienced something similar to the baobabs, the growth stop phenomenon, where if there's bad conditions for a number of years, they don't grow. So not an ignorant question. It's a great question, actually. Thank you. Okay. Any more questions? I forgot to say, I have to say this, Stellenbosch University Botanical Garden does receive donations, so if you'd like to support this work, you can get a tax-free donation with them, and you can find any information according to that on their website. And you can say specifically, only give this to the quiver trees. But yeah, always love
Can we
to.
just get the money to you?
Yeah. I'll send it to them. Yeah. But yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
All right, should I switch this?
If you're not on our WhatsApp group, you can talk to me or Michelle afterwards, and we can send general snippets and notifications.
Can I stay on the WhatsApp group now? Okay, thanks everybody online.